The committee will now come to order. Federal contractors are a key part of our government's operations. The services and products that they provide play a critical role in delivering services to the American people, as well as keeping our nation safe. From advanced defense systems to cutting-edge cybersecurity, contractors are entrusted with information and responsibilities that can impact the national and economic security of our nation. From modernizing and enhancing the safety of our infrastructure and power grid to providing critical intelligence that safeguards our nation from foreign and domestic threats, the scope of government contractors' support is immeasurable. To ensure that government contractors are working in the best interest of Americans, we must ensure they are meeting the highest standards of integrity, impartiality, and transparency by removing conflicts of interest from their work. Conflicts of interest are not minor infractions. They pose threats that undermine our national security and economic competitiveness and can dangerously erode the American people's trust in their government. Over the past decade, there have been alarming reports of federal contractors who are simultaneously promoting competing interests, including those of foreign adversaries, interests that directly contradict our national security needs and hurt our economic competitiveness. For example, in the summer of 2023, in one of the largest intrusions of U.S. government cloud services, Chinese state-backed hackers gained access to the emails of high-level officials, compromising the information security of U.S. officials who work on national and economic security matters. This attack has raised serious concerns that China-backed hackers were able to steal this information because of the service provider's partnership with a Chinese entity, while they were providing services to the United States government at exactly the same time. In 2015, a consulting firm responsible for advising the U.S. government on national security strategy, cybersecurity, and cutting-edge technology was simultaneously advising Chinese state-run enterprises. And this consulting work for Chinese enterprises involved China's naval fleet and Chinese government efforts to raise its profile and strengthen its position and power globally, a goal in direct competition with American interest. In another example, the same firm's research and recommendations allegedly assisted in the creation of the Chinese government's Made in China 2025 industrial plan in opposition to U.S. foreign policy objectives and our national and economic security. These examples demonstrate the need to strengthen our laws, specifically around the disclosure of foreign ties, and particularly where federal contractors are providing services to authoritarian governments who seek to bolster their economic and geographic assets in competition with our nation. In sectors like defense and cybersecurity, the stakes are incredibly high. Just last week, FBI Director Wray announced the FBI had successfully disrupted a malware attack targeting over 200,000 devices in the US and worldwide by a Chinese-backed hacking group called Flax Typhoon. The Chinese cyber actor exploited known vulnerabilities, including in a major US cloud service provider that receives billions in US taxpayer dollars each year to support the federal government's IT services. It goes without saying that major US-based technology service providers working for foreign adversaries while performing multi-billion-dollar contracts for the United States government risk exposing vulnerabilities that can be exploited by our adversaries. We can and must stop this. In 2022, my bipartisan bill, the Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisition Act, was signed into law. The bill seeks to end conflicts of interest from federal contracts that provide critical services to the American people. It directed the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council, or FAR Council, to provide clear guidance to agencies and federal contractors on ways to identify, mitigate, and even avoid conflicts of interest. Despite being signed into law nearly 2 years ago, the FAR Council is late in issuing guidance required by my law, which is why yesterday I led the co-sponsors this legislation in a letter pressing for quick action to issue this desperately needed guidance. I continue to call on the FAR Council, which includes the General Services Administration, NASA, the Department of Defense, and the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, to provide better guidance to agencies on how to handle conflicts of interest. Earlier this year, I also worked with Senator Hawley on his bill, the Time to Choose Act of 2024, which would add guardrails to prevent consulting firms that are under contract with foreign adversaries from simultaneously providing services to the Department of Defense and other agencies. I joined the bill along with Senators Rick Scott and Marco Rubio to ensure contracting firms are using taxpayer funds responsibly and to help prevent foreign adversaries from exploiting business relationships with contractors to interfere with American interest. I am confident that we can all agree that Americans deserve full assurance that federal contractors are providing transparency and avoiding any potential conflicts before they are awarded taxpayer dollars. And that's why we still have work to do. Today's hearing will help us better identify and mitigate conflicts of interest in the ever-evolving global landscape. Our witnesses will examine inadequacies within the federal contracting rules, as well as explore steps that can be taken to mitigate future risk. And I thank each of them for being here today and look forward to a very productive conversation. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Paul for his opening statement.
In a speech in 1985, Ronald Reagan addressed an audience of business and trade leaders, stating, "I, like you, recognize the inescapable conclusion that all history is taught. The freer the flow of world trade, the stronger the tides of human progress and peace among nations." While today's topic is about conflicts of interest, this hearing is yet one more opportunity for Washington to reject this conclusion in its insatiable desire to impose sanctions on China and to restrict trade. While it is clear that we have an adversarial relationship with China, there is another way. In the past 30 years, it's undeniable that the economic interaction between the U.S. and China has been a substantial driver of both Chinese and American economic growth. As President Reagan pointed out nearly 40 years ago, trade will not only strengthen the tides of human progress, but also increase prospects for peace. The London School of Economics recently found that trade with China has boosted the average American household purchasing power by $1,500 just since 2001. These effects are substantially higher among low-income households, reaching as high as an additional $1,700 per year in purchasing power. Studies by Oxford and Harvard have found that trade with China has led to a net job creation. In 2019 alone, trade with China was directly responsible for 1.2 million American jobs. We should think twice before ending relations and ending trade with China. Despite the tense relationship we've had with China since 2017, China remains the U.S.'s third largest trading partner behind Mexico and Canada, accounting for about 10% of all American trade in 2024. China also remains the world's second largest consumer market, only behind the U.S. Even so, many in the Senate and across Congress fail to recognize the trade-offs that come with the antagonistic and extreme restrictions of foreign trade of goods and services. It's not just China that suffers from these policies, but also American households, American small business owners, and even at times American strategic objectives. Some argue that we should prioritize domestic contractors. A recent report from the Peterson Institute found that in 2017 alone, Buy America requirements cost the U.S. taxpayer $94 billion. This is effectively a $715 tax per American family. To make matters worse, the same study found that the mandates had little to no effect on net job growth. So even American workers who are also consumers are made poorer by these requirements. Another recent study found that repealing all Buy American mandates on U.S. procurement would even generate an additional 300,000 jobs and lead to significant advancements in U.S. infrastructure goals. Unserious legislation that seeks to comprehensively ban firms that sell to foreign markets from federal contracts not only harms our competitiveness and dynamism of the U.S. business contracting with the federal government, but also the strategic aims and interests of the U.S. government itself. People worry that contractors who work for the Chinese government will be influenced by Chinese communism, it's also that the reverse may be true, that American contractors contracting for the Chinese government may be bringing an influence from America and from American capitalism as well. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how simultaneously to mitigate the risks that may come from conflicts of interest while still maintaining the competitiveness and dynamism brought about by the free markets and free trade that makes all Americans more prosperous.
Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses, so if each of you would please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Our first witness is Jessica Tillipman. She is the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies and a distinguished professor lecturer in government contracts law, practice, and policy. Dean Tillipman is an internationally recognized expert and prolific author on government procurement integrity and compliance issues. She's also a senior advisor to the American Bar Association, International Anti-Corruption Committee, a faculty advisor to the Public Contract Law Journal, and an advisory board member of the government contractor. Dean Tillipman, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to testify before the committee today. I am Jessica Tillipman, the Associate Dean for Government Procurement Law Studies at the George Washington University Law School. Over the past several years, organizational conflicts of interest, or OCIs, have received an increasing amount of attention given high-profile incidents that have highlighted weaknesses in this area of the law. Although I was very pleased to see the enactment of the Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisition Act, which addresses several gaps in the current OCI framework, given that the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council has yet to issue a proposed OCI rule in response to that legislation, this hearing provides an opportunity to renew focus on the issues that continue to hinder federal agencies' ability to effectively address OCIs. Today's hearing focuses primarily on a specific type of OCI, impaired objectivity, which may arise where a contractor's outside business interests and relationships create an economic incentive to provide biased advice under a government contract. Although OCIs have been regulated since the 1960s, they've become more frequent in recent decades due to industry consolidation and the outsourcing of services traditionally performed by the government. OCIs are more likely to occur in contracts involving professional services, including management support, consultant, or advisory services, which is notable given the hundreds of billions of dollars the U.S. government spends each year on these professional services. Despite widespread acknowledgement for the past several decades that this could create fertile ground for conflicts of interest, government regulation of these potential hazards has not kept pace. The decades-long absence of an update to the federal government's approach to OCIs has weakened U.S. procurement system and left it vulnerable to integrity and national security risks. Today's hearing is focused on a potential national security concern that may stem from companies that maintain intelligence or defense contracts with the United States while simultaneously contracting with foreign adversaries. If these interests are neither disclosed nor mitigated, it increases the risk that sensitive information may be exploited or fall into the wrong hands. It also increases the risk that contractors may be unable to provide impartial assistance or advice due to their competing relationships with certain foreign governments. The current framework governing OCIs, which has remained largely unchanged since 1984, is outdated, inconsistent with modern procurement practices, and fails to address the growing risks associated with the government's increasing reliance on contractors to provide services which include advice and the exercise of judgment. This has led some contracting officials to treat OCI assessments as a rote, check-the-box exercise rather than a meaningful, thorough, and rigorous analysis. Moreover, the lack of a standard FAR OCI solicitation provision or contract clause has left agencies to fill this vacuum with their own provisions and clauses, leading to severe inconsistencies in agency approaches to this area of the law. And most glaringly, the FAR lacks critical definitions and does not thoroughly address compliance, disclosure, or mitigation obligations. This absence of guidance has led to a paradoxical issue of both over and under compliance. Some contracting officials may never even consider OCI risks, whereas others may reflexively and improperly exclude a contractor from competition. A new OCI rule should provide clarity, more expansive definitions, greater guidance for contracting officers, updated illustrated examples, and enhanced disclosure and compliance requirements for relevant contractors. This effort should be buttressed by robust training requirements for contracting officials as well. As this committee and the FAR Council consider remedies to these issues, a cautionary approach is necessary. Draconian approaches to addressing concerns can not only undermine the goals of legislative and regulatory reform, but create new problems. Striking a balance between necessary and excessive regulation is never easy, but it's critical. And it's my hope that a thoughtful and nuanced approach to OCI reform will address integrity and security concerns, bring greater clarity to the existing regulations, and create a more uniform approach across the federal government. Thank you for the opportunity to share these thoughts with you. I would be pleased to answer any questions you have for me.
Thank you. Our next witness, Doshi, is the CV Starr Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council of Foreign Relations. His expertise includes China's foreign policy, U.S. strategy towards China, cross-strait issues, and Indo-Pacific security. But before joining the Council of Foreign Relations, Dr. Doshi was Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan on the National Security Council, where he served from 2021 to 2024 and helped manage the Security Council's first China Directorate. Dr. Doshi is an assistant professor in Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He is the author of The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order. Dr. Doshi is also a co-editor of Global China, Assessing China's Growing Role in the World. Dr. Doshi, welcome, and you're recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, distinguished members of the committee, I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. I'll focus my remarks on 4 questions related to China. First, what are Beijing's ambitions? Second, how does Beijing create conflicts of interest for U.S. companies? Third, how do those conflicts threaten U.S. national security? And fourth, what can we do about it? So first, what are Beijing's ambitions? The PRC has a grand strategy to displace U.S.-led order. It seeks to catch up and surpass the U.S. technologically, to reduce dependence on others while increasing their dependence on China economically, and to acquire the capability to defeat U.S. military forces in the region. It's the leading industrial power globally and the first U.S. competitors to surpass 70% of U.S. GDP in a century. And it is mounting a campaign to compromise U.S. critical infrastructure and steal U.S. data and technology, aided in part by conflicts of interest among U.S. companies. So second, how does Beijing create conflicts of interest? Well, unlike in the Cold War, U.S. companies are deeply involved in the PRC economy. One source of these conflicts is PRC threats to deny market access unless U.S. companies take steps against their interests or national interests, like to transfer intellectual property, enter joint ventures, censor their speech, or even refrain from taking China to court if they're treated unfairly. The PRC even threatens foreign executives with exit bans to keep them in China, and their companies with costly regulatory action, all without due process. But there's another source of conflicts that's new and expansive, and that's PRC national security legislation. And I'll list 3 broad trends. First, the CCP is pushing to embed Chinese Communist Party cells in foreign companies, and it wants them to play a role in corporate governance, strategic decision-making, personnel management, corporate charters, and even board processes. Second, the PRC's national intelligence law and counterespionage law would require U.S. subsidiaries, their employees, and their PRC partners to cooperate with PRC intelligence services and not to tell anyone. According to DHS, that could mean supporting efforts to install backdoors or steal U.S. data. And third, these new PRC national security laws pry open the networks, encryption keys, and data of U.S. companies in the PRC and to the PRC. The cybersecurity law requires U.S. company data to be stored in China and accessible to the security services. The encryption law requires companies to turn over their encryption keys to the Chinese government. The data security law says Beijing must approve cross-border data flows even for answering subpoenas from committees like this one. And the state secrets law expands the definition of covered data to virtually anything the PRC wants it to be. So third, how do these conflicts harm U.S. national security? Well, as we all know, PRC cyber actors have compromised sensitive U.S. sectors, the USG email systems, defense companies, and critical infrastructure providers for gas and water and other systems. And yet the very companies that serve these sectors also operate in China in ways that could put those services here at greater risk. Take software. The U.S. government relies on Microsoft software, but to access China's market, Microsoft turned over source code for that software to the PRC. So did IBM and others. And that could plausibly create cybersecurity risks, and those risks should be accounted for in contracting. Take cloud services. Microsoft and Amazon provide cloud services to the USG. But to enter China, they had to turn over operation of their cloud services to a Chinese joint venture that is legally required to cooperate with PRC intelligence. That means the PRC can learn a good deal about the topology, architecture, and the vulnerabilities of these systems, and that, too, needs to be accounted for in contracting. Now take research. Many tech companies operate research centers in China. The PRC can access all that research. And if those researchers discover what are called zero-day vulnerabilities, they have to turn those over to the PRC before they tell anyone else. Microsoft believes that the PRC uses this regulatory process to stockpile and weaponize zero-day exploits against the United States. Finally, take consulting. Companies that contract with the USG or US companies should not use that knowledge and expertise to help the PRC government. And yet, McKinsey affiliates help China structure its industrial policy programs to do just that. Other consulting firms in China were rated by the PRC, Bain, Capvision, the Minsk Group. All that also needs to be reflected in contracting. So what do we do about this? That's where I'll end. I think time to choose is very important legislation, but it could be broader than consulting, and it could apply to the serious risks posed by technology service providers that I've discussed today. In addition, Congress could prohibit firms that contract with the USG from hosting CCP cells, from complying with PRC national security laws, or from entering any arrangements with PRC entities that could plausibly threaten U.S. national security, from sharing source code to entering certain joint ventures. All this actually helps our companies do business in China by pushing back on unfair PRC demands. And I'll end by noting that profits in China for some of these companies are falling, even as the risks to the U.S. are growing. China, for example, is only 1.5% of Microsoft's revenue. IBM's pulling out already. The solutions that we're considering today are common sense. They're less costly and disruptive today than they would have been years earlier. I think now is the time to consider them, and I thank you for your time.
Thank you. Our next witness is Clark Packard. Mr. Packard is a research fellow at the Herbert A. Stiefel Center for Trade Policy Studies at the Cato Institute. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, Mr. Packard was a resident fellow at the R Street Institute, focusing on international trade policy. He previously worked at the National Taxpayers Union doing the same, and prior to those roles, he served as an attorney and policy advisor to 2 South Carolina governors. Earlier in his career, he spent 3 years in private legal practice. Mr. Packard is a contributor to Foreign Policy and has written for National Review, Lawfare, The Bulwark, Business Insider, The National Interest, and other publications. Mr. Packard, welcome. You're recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Clark Packard. I'm a research fellow at the Cato Institute. My work at Cato focuses on U.S. international trade and investment policy with a specific focus on the U.S.-China economic relationship. For that reason, I'm especially grateful for the opportunity to testify today. Let me state unequivocally at the outset that China does engage in abusive and at times coercive international trade and investment practices. Many of those activities are done in support of widespread industrial policy. My testimony will focus on the potential, though, for abuse of national security-based protectionism and provide suggestions for outcompeting China in the 21st century. Free traders from Adam Smith to Milton Friedman have understood the need for limited exceptions for national security. An American firm providing consulting services to the Department of Defense, for example, should not also be advising the Chinese government or the Chinese Communist Party. At the very least, American firms should be required to disclose potential conflicts of interest when bidding on U.S. government contracts for close scrutiny by American procurement officials. To the extent that I have suggestions about legislation with such aims, it would be to ensure stringent guardrails are established to avoid stifling legitimate business practices. Too often, national security is invoked as a pretext for simple protectionism. The Trump administration's national security tariffs on steel and aluminum imports imposed despite President Trump's defense secretary at the time noting the U.S. military required only 3% of domestic steel and aluminum production is a case in point. Indeed, the tariffs still apply to steel and aluminum from NATO members and other longstanding allies like Japan and South Korea. Those tariffs are extremely costly to the U.S. economy, harming industries that use steel and aluminum as inputs, U.S. consumers, and Americans targeted by foreign retaliations such as farmers and ranchers. In addition, the tariffs undermine confidence in the U.S. as a reliable trading partner. Imposed under the guise of national security, the tariffs inflicted considerable economic damage, the expected result of protectionist measures, while doing nothing to bolster our national defense. Likewise, national security-based arguments are being invoked as the rationale to block Nippon Steel's acquisition of U.S. steel, but there's no security risk at all. Japan is the largest provider of foreign direct investment in the United States, and U.S. Steel has no security contracts. For more than 60 years, Japan has been one of the United States' strongest allies and currently hosts more than 55,000 U.S. military personnel. It is incongruent that the United States would deploy nuclear weapons if necessary to defend Japan from attack, yet simultaneously claim Japanese investment as a national security risk to the United States. Today, Japan receives 90% of its defense-related imports from the United States. Simply put, Nippon would not be paying a premium to purchase U.S. steel only to shutter it. Indeed, Nippon would most likely provide the investment necessary to strengthen the firm. Turning to Beijing, it's worth noting that the Chinese economy is struggling and faces significant short and longer-term headwinds that will surely constrain future growth. We should not overestimate its strength. Right-sizing the challenge is imperative to sound policy. That said, Beijing does pose very serious challenges to the United States, both economically and strategically. The United States, however, should not respond to those challenges by turning inward and hiding behind protectionist walls. Instead, policymakers should work to strengthen trade and investment ties with close allies, particularly those in the Asia-Pacific region. While flawed, the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have created an American-led trade bloc to offset China's gravitational pull in the region economically and establish higher quality trade and investment rules and norms. In the absence of U.S. re-engagement in TPP, the U.S. should build on its successful bilateral agreement with South Korea, known as KORUS. Given the thawing in relations between Seoul and Tokyo, adding Japan and other allied countries to KORUS presents a next best option. Likewise, policymakers should adopt the House Select Committee on the Chinese Communist Party's wise recommendation to expedite CFIUS review of FDI from trusted allies like Japan and South Korea. The U.S.-China relationship is increasingly complex and is the top geopolitical issue facing the world. How these two countries will manage this relationship will greatly affect global peace, prosperity, and stability in the 21st century. The guiding principle of our economic policy vis-a-vis China should focus on affirming market incentives that boost the performance and competitiveness of American firms and those of our allies. I look forward to answering any questions the committee may have. Thank you.
Our last witness is Bryan Riley. Mr. Riley is director of the National Taxpayers Union Free Trade Initiative. His background includes service in the Reagan administration and years of research on the impact that trade has had on people in the United States. He has led grassroots campaigns in support of initiatives like the North American Free Trade Agreement and has been quoted in publications including the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. He is an in-demand speaker who travels the country explaining the benefits of international trade and the investment that it brings to Americans. Mr. Riley, welcome. You're recognized for your opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Peters. Thank you, Ranking Member Paul. Founded in 1969, National Taxpayers Union is the oldest taxpayer group in the United States. We serve as the voice of America's taxpayers and strive to represent their best interests before government at all levels, and to appreciate your committee's important work in protecting our national security and the opportunity to be here today. With respect to federal contracting specifically, NTU encourages Congress to make the best use of taxpayer dollars. And Chairman Peters, I duly noted your mention of the importance of using taxpayer funds responsibly in your introductory remarks. With respect to Buy American laws, former President and Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower observed, "It is unfair to the taxpayer for the government to pay a premium on its purchases." Senator Paul has already pointed out that in 2017, these Buy American restrictions cost taxpayers an estimated $94 billion, an amount that is certainly higher today. Improving these Buy American laws would help control spending. This is especially important in a year in which the federal government is projected to spend more on interest payments than on the military for the first time in U.S. history. Removing barriers to goods and services provided by U.S. allies would also strengthen our national security. We submit the following considerations with respect to the proposed Time to Choose Act and similar proposals. As a disclaimer, these comments are based on the text available, on the publicly available version of the text. There have been some modifications which may mitigate some of these concerns, but I believe they still broadly apply and are even more broadly applicable to similar efforts. This legislation in particular does not appear to require a demonstration of a specific national security threat resulting from covered transactions. It is simply you provide a service to China's government, you get banned here. Such legislation could represent a slippery slope. For example, China is the largest export market for U.S. agricultural producers, with products often purchased by state-owned enterprises in China. This does not necessarily mean that it would be wise for the government to ban the purchase of farm products by the Department of Agriculture or school lunch programs. In addition, in the future, it's possible that a company that contracts with the federal government could conceivably be penalized for doing business in a country with different environmental, labor, or social practices that go far beyond the scope of this particular law. These are not just hypothetical concerns. As Clark Packard has already pointed out, we already restrict purchases of steel and aluminum from friendly countries, including Israel, to the United Kingdom, based on dubious national security grounds. And I welcome thoughts from anyone who can explain to me how these national security tariffs and quotas strengthen our security. Moreover, when some politicians and policymakers are seeking to reduce the U.S.-China trade deficit, it should be noted that any restrictions on U.S. firms being able to provide goods and services to China or other countries would tend to increase that deficit, exacerbating calls for tariffs and other restrictions. To be clear, National Taxpayers Union supports efforts to protect our national security interests, but we urge you to keep these risks in mind. My final point, with respect to efforts from many to decouple the U.S. and China economies, keep in mind that perhaps the strongest link between our economy and China's is not from the private sector, but is represented by the $776.5 billion that the federal government owes China. Reducing that debt would be a good starting point in distancing our economy from China's, as would adopting tax and regulatory measures that would make us the best place in the world to do business. Thank you again for your time and for your work and for the opportunity to testify today, and we'd be glad to answer any questions. Thank you.
Last Congress, my bill, the Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisition Act, was signed into law. It requires modernizing the Federal Acquisition Regulation, known as FAR, to make it easier for agency contracting officers to identify and to address conflicts of interest. Unfortunately, the updated guidance that was due in June of this year has yet to be issued. And yesterday, I sent a letter to the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council urging them to swiftly implement my law to ensure that taxpayer dollars are used in the best interests of the American people. Dean Tillipman, until the FAR issues updated guidance based on this law that has passed, would you explain to the committee how federal agencies are currently addressing potential conflicts of interest involving their contractors?
Thank you, Senator. Unevenly is the best way to describe it. Without a standardized FAR clause or solicitation provision, each agency is basically left on their own to come up with their own approach to organizational conflicts of interest, which has led to severe inconsistencies among agency approaches. Moreover, given the failure of the Federal Acquisition Regulatory Council to update the FAR in several decades, we have outdated definitions and guidance that have not appropriately captured the many risks that continue to grow and create more conflicts of interest, ranging from the security concerns we're talking about here, to commercial conflicts of interest, to even the risks associated with emerging technology. So by not providing those updated definitions or illustrated guides, we're lacking that additional information to give not only contracting officers the awareness to approach this proactively, but the comfort to look to guidance to support their decision-making.
So if you'd give us perhaps a little more detailed answer as to what tools specifically do you believe are needed for agency contracting officers to more effectively identifying, in the first place, those conflicts of interest and why?
Sure. So currently, the FAR it provides very minimal guidance when it comes to how contracting officials should approach OCIs. Most of the guidance that they turn to comes from decisions that come from GAO and from the Court of Federal Claims. It's not necessarily the FAR itself. So the FAR could truly benefit from providing greater procedural directives and guidance for the contracting officials. The next is that the updated or the illustrative definitions or illustrated guidance that's in the FAR does not reflect modern procurement practices. So it doesn't have additional guidance to help contracting officials even identify potential OCIs or the growing risks that may be out there. At a baseline, there needs to be a standard FAR provision, clause or provision to guide agencies across the federal government. The way that we're currently approaching it with agencies using their own clauses, again, has led to severe inconsistencies. And I think this also needs to be buttressed by robust training requirements. Too many contracting officials, frankly, don't understand this issue, are not aware of this issue. And as I noted before, it's led to this issue where some contracting officials may, be nervous about the threat, for example, of a bid protest and may reflexively eliminate a contractor from competition, whereas other contracting officials may not even be aware that they're looking at an OCI risk and may do nothing at all. So again, having greater guidance, having greater definitions, greater directives, I think will really do a lot to further this area of the law.
So in addition to all those changes and clauses, what specifically should be put into federal contracts, do you believe, to ensure that the issues that you raise are addressed?
Sure. So I think at a baseline, having a standard OCI provision or clause is going to be key. Currently, agencies rely on their own. So again, that's led to different approaches depending on which agency a contractor is working with at that time. We appreciate uniformity in the federal procurement space, and this clearly lacks it in that area. The other thing when we're talking about clauses, you really don't need to reinvent the wheel. A lot of agencies have fairly robust contracting clauses that they already use. I think it should be fairly broad. There is language that would basically require contractors to identify any facts that any reasonably prudent person may cause them to question a contractor's impartiality or potential bias. So something very broad, I think, is important. Something that gets flowed down to throughout the supply chain, I think, would be critical. So again, we have that there. I think the other key component is to make sure that it is an ongoing assessment. The concern is that if you have contractors basically only disclosing potentially OCI risks at the outset, it doesn't necessarily capture any OCIs that may occur during performance of a contract. The U.S. procurement system is not great at ongoing oversight during contract performance when it comes to these issues, but it could truly benefit from having at least that component of the clause, because then it places the onus or the burden on the contractor to make those affirmative disclosures.
So in your testimony, you mentioned the concept of impaired objectivity, a type of conflict of interest. And so if you could give the committee some examples of what you mean by this type of conflict. And second, why are federal contracts with consulting firms or technology service providers particularly susceptible to this conflict?
So impaired objectivity OCIs can arise in a variety of contexts. Commonly within the federal space, it would be a scenario where, for example, a contractor would be required to review its own performance or the performance of an affiliate on a separate contract. That happens fairly frequently, where it might have to evaluate its own performance, Clearly, there could be bias there. In the context of what we're discussing here, and even in the context of what we were discussing in 2002 before the House Oversight Committee, we're dealing with competing interests, right? So there's a competing commercial interest or a competing foreign interest, or frankly, even with emerging technology, there can be competing interests and bias there as well. And so because of that, there's a concern that the advice that is given to the government might be biased in some way because of that external competing interest. And so, how these contracts in particular pose a greater risk? Well, now we're relying on contractors to provide advice in something that requires the exercise of judgment. And here there's much greater risk rather than, buying a pen, or buying a boat, that somebody could give advice that's tainted because of that competing interest or because they're put in a position to evaluate their own performance.
Thank you. Ranking Member Paul, recognized for your questions.
Over the years, I've been an outspoken critic of socialism in general, Chinese socialism, Mao, the history of trying to get to, absolute socialism in China. I wrote a book, The Case Against Socialism. I wrote a book recently called Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up, talking about how the Chinese government encouraged this gain-of-function research, which we also funded, but also how there was a cover-up in trying to discover the cause or the origin of the virus. That being said, I'm worried about legislation that begins to ban trade with China. If you say, oh, we're going to only ban consultants that do consulting for the Chinese Communist government, we don't want them doing business with our government then. We're not going to prevent them from doing business, but they can still do it, but they lose government. The problem with that is that government's such a big consumer in our country of it, they probably will have to give up one or the other. The other thing is let's say they decided to keep doing work in China, it damages their ability in the private marketplace because you've now given them a scarlet letter. You have decided that, like the McCarthyites of old, you're going to brand them as communist friendly. This could be consulting, but, we've mentioned some big companies. Microsoft has done business, maybe a little less than they used to, but they have done business in China. So has Apple, and they agree to things that we might disagree with. We might say they shouldn't accept these things where they give the Chinese access to their data, which primarily to spy on Chinese citizens, because people buying Apple phones over there realize that all those data and all the servers are owned by the Chinese. You can disagree with it, but it really isn't any of your business. Now you can say, well, we're going to ban Apple then from doing work with the U.S. government. Half the people on this, dais have Apple phones. We're going to prevent anybody from government from having Apple phones because Apple has made this compromise to do business in China. I think that Mr. Riley mentioned the slippery slope. The slippery slope goes on and on and on, and it's, where do you end? There also is a real question whether or not Apple that sells a lot of cell phones or McKinsey or any of these other American companies that work in China, are they being influenced by Chinese communism or worried they're going to come over here and then be a conduit to steal our stuff? McCarthy would be proud. He'd love to be part of this conversation to ban stuff, go after the communists in our government. But it's also possible that the complete opposite is true, that they actually influence the Chinese more towards American ways, that the more we do business in China, the more they see and deal with Americans on a one-to-one basis, the better it is to try to influence the communist culture. Look, we tried this in Cuba. Let's get those commies. Let's quit trading with communist China. We'll defeat the Castros. Well, guess what? It didn't work. It objectively didn't work. Over a 40, 50-year period, communism didn't necessarily thrive, but continued under the iron fist of the Castros. Trade embargoes don't work. Sanctions, frankly, don't work. And you say, well, the Chinese do all this stuff. Well, what are they doing? Are they doing it de novo out of nowhere? No, and we don't like a lot of it. Some of it is theft. Some of it's downright illegal, and we ought to do stuff about things that are illegal. If any contractor's, coordinating something that's illegal, they ought to be banned from doing business without question. Illegal. But the thing is that we put all these sanctions on China. Some of the things China does aren't de novo. They aren't out of nothing. They do it in response to things we do to them. This is the way trade wars work. It's not really been a trade war, although there's some of that now, but it's been the sanctions after sanctions. And everybody comes in from the State Department, I say, well, how are those sanctions working? Can you name me one Chinese policy where they have changed their policy because of a sanction? No, they just get annoyed with us, and they go further towards Russia and further towards Korea. That's what's going to happen from all this. Every day there's a new bill banning business with China. We still, 10% of our trade is with them. You guys want to end it? People want to end it tomorrow? You'll have no antibiotics. You won't have any pharmaceuticals. Trade is good, and we need to, I said in my opening, the average taxpayer still is saving $1,000 or $1,500 from trade with China. As you begin to ban things, as you ban consultants, there is collateral damage to these companies, because you can't be a company in most of America being banned from U.S. government business because U.S. government's a big purchaser, but also it kills your private business too. Who wants to do business with, communist-loving ex-company that does business with communists? So just, we've got to take a breath and step back from all of this. Mr. Riley, do you think it's a good idea to, end trade with China? Are there not benefits that Americans still have from trade with China?
Well, I think you can go from extremes, anything goes with no restraints, to we're stopping everything. A lot of the discussion seems to be pointing towards that we're just going to stop everything and just ban it, and somehow that's going to fix everything. I think the most recent and maybe clearest example of how these policies don't work in the way they're allegedly intended to is our Section 301 tariffs on China, which have cost the average household about $1,700 so far and counting. President Biden's U.S. trade representative studied the effects of these over 4 years and came out with a long report detailing all the ways in which China's policies, not only have they not improved, they've gotten worse. They've gotten worse. And so what do? We're adding even more tariffs on top of that. If the goal of the tariffs is to change China, we have plenty of evidence that they don't work in that regard, and I think we need to do something smarter. Probably expanding trade with our allies would be a really good step in the right direction.
Right. Well, and see, it gets back to how do you convince people to do something you want? If you scold them or tell them not to do things, they often will do the opposite. So, for example, there was a discussion recently in China. We'd like them to quit selling dual-use parts to Russia that Russia's using in the war with Ukraine. So do you think scolding them works? No, it doesn't work. They do the opposite. There are things we could trade. What we've traded is tariffs get higher, their tariffs get higher. Well, we could offer to lower some of the tariffs on their goods in exchange for better behavior. That would be a transaction. That would be, we give you something, you give us something. But instead, everything is about ending trade, stopping business, more sanctions. You're going to keep getting the same response. You want better relations with China, or you just want to end it all? You can end it all. It'll be a disaster for everybody. Or you can say, how does it work? Do we do more sanctions? Do we yell at them? Do we travel to their country and scold them? Or do we say, be very quietly when we're in their country, hey, what about we might reduce some of our trade barriers, some of our sanctions, if you'll do X? You'd get a lot more with honey than you will with vinegar. And this is a big trade, and a big issue, and bigger than even this particular panel. But we have to have these discussions, and it's go on and on, because every day there's a new bill that bans trade and bans companies from China. Many of these employ Americans in my state and other states, and we need to get away from this protectionism and remember what Bastiat said: when goods don't cross borders, soldiers will. Thank you.
Senator Hall, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for calling this hearing. Thanks to each of the witnesses for being here today on this important topic. Dr. Doshi, if I could just start with you. Since 2008, the McKinsey Company has done nearly $1 billion in consulting work for the United States government. $1 billion. And its top client has been the Defense Department. In fact, it's got contracts with the Defense Department, with the U.S. Department of the Navy, with the Homeland Security Department, with Customs and Border Patrol. I think in 2021 alone, McKinsey had Defense Department or other security agency contracts worth $850 million. It's absolutely extraordinary. And yet, at the same time, they're also doing business with the Chinese government. They are simultaneously taking $1 billion from the United States and its security agencies, and also getting money from not just China in general, from the Chinese government and Chinese-controlled entities. Explain to us why that is a problem. I think any normal American who's sitting out there and hears that would be absolutely outraged by it, and rightly so. Why are they getting taxpayer money advising our military and simultaneously advising the Chinese military? But just explain to us, why is this a national security concern?
Well, thank you, Senator Hawley. I agree this is a national security concern. I would go further. I mean, the nature of the work that McKinsey did reportedly involved helping China consider how to outcompete U.S. technology firms, how to strengthen Made in China 2025. The goal was to help them advance their goals for technological dominance. And that is directly at odds with the interests not just of the U.S. government, but also of the corporate clients they had in the United States that they were also advising. So there's a clear conflict of interest there. And it's also, the kind of conflict of interest that even if McKinsey had exercised better judgment about the projects it took on, other firms doing business in China are getting raided by the Chinese government. Oftentimes, that means that their data is no longer secure. And if they have U.S. client data on those servers, well, that's now Chinese data. So there's a lot of concerns, I think, that we can raise here. One is the nature of the work. Another is being a vector for the transfer of information and data. And there's a third concern, too, which is that some of these firms have mutually irreconcilable obligations to the United States and to China. China's basically saying, if you want to comply with the subpoena from this committee, you can't, because we have a data security law saying you can. That's three different kinds of conflicts beyond the one, Senator, that you just identified.
Well, that's terrific. As we think about the different things that McKinsey has advised China on, they are, for example, a major proponent and promoter of China's Belt and Road Initiative. So here they are, again, taking $1 billion in contracts from the United States military, simultaneously advising China on their Belt and Road Initiative, which is meant to undermine our military and also to undermine American companies all across the world. McKinsey has advised 9 of the top 15 Chinese contractors for the Belt and Road Initiative as of 2018. I mean, it's shameless when you think about it. It is absolutely shameless. Interestingly, I recently obtained a document related to a contract, just to give one example, involving semiconductors. So semiconductors, McKinsey entered into a contract with the U.S. government, our Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, DARPA, in 2021 related to semiconductors. The DoD asked McKinsey if there was any conflict that they might have with the Chinese government. According to these documents recently released to me pursuant to a FOIA request, McKinsey submitted documentation that said that there were no conflicts at all. And in fact, as we now know, they were simultaneously advising the Chinese government on a very similar project. I mean, this to me, it seems like such common sense. The chairman and I wrote to the GAO asking for an analysis of the conflict of interest law and analysis of the procurement and contract awarding process to see if there were any strictures, limitations in current law that would prevent companies like McKinsey from simultaneously making billions from the United States and making billions on China. That report has just come back just a couple of days ago. And what it shows is that there are no such restrictions in United States law currently, which is why our legislation, the Time to Choose Act, which the chairman and I co-sponsored together, introduced and passed this committee almost unanimously, I think only one no vote, is so important because it would prevent what we see on this poster behind me. Ms. Tillipman, do you want to add to this why this sort of common sense set of restrictions telling consulting firms you can't consult for the U.S. government and rake in billions from American taxpayers and consult for our chief adversary at the same time, why this is important and why it's a matter of national security?
Thank you, Senator. I read that GAO report, and I join you in your concern about the lack of laws and guidance right now currently guiding contracting officials on this issue. One thing I will note is that the FAR provisions related to conflicts of interest are quite broad and could capture some of this, but most government officials won't feel comfortable taking this sort of action without greater guidance and directives explicitly giving them comfort that they can look to in taking these sorts of actions. I share similar concerns as you. I get nervous when things are too restrictive and there's too many absolutes, but you raise very good points about why contracting officials need better laws and need to be empowered to make these types of decisions.
Yeah, very good. Mr. Riley, let me just ask you, because your exchange with Senator Paul I thought was illuminating. You said that there's a continuum between banning everything on the one end and then everything goes on the other end. So I take it from your testimony today, you're on the anything goes side of the spectrum.
No.
So you support this bill then?
As I mentioned in my comments earlier, we support the goals. but we're concerned that it leads to a slippery slope, potentially. We 100% support legislation that would advance our national security and protect our national security. I will say, based on the conversation I've heard this morning, if these companies are giving China advice, either they're giving pretty bad advice or China's not taking it very well because their economy is on the downhill slide instead of going up. If they are legitimate...
Well, wait a minute. They're on the march in the Pacific. McKinsey advised them on building out islands in the South China Sea. At the same time, it was getting defense contracts. So I guess, is your position that you are opposed to, you want companies to be able to get taxpayer money from the United States and simultaneously get money from the Chinese government? That's fine?
My concern, Senator, is how do you differentiate between that, how you draw the line between that, and a soybean farmer, which depends on China for its exports, and simultaneously...
The soybean farmer isn't advising the Chinese military on how to take over the United States. I come from a state where our #1 agricultural product is soybeans.
Right.
We are a state of soybean farmers, and I can tell you, I think they would take great offense to you comparing them to a consulting firm that is taking $1 billion in money from the United States military while simultaneously advising the Chinese military on how to harm the United States. Are you saying that soybean farmers harm the security interests of the United States? I think that's a ridiculous position.
As I said, with respect to 232 national security legislation, it starts out here. The next thing you know, we're restricting trade with the UK, with Israel, with our allies.
That's not
how do you know that's not going to happen again? That's all I'm asking. We need to have guardrails to make sure that our soybean farmers and other producers aren't harmed like we have been in recent years by our trade
I think that's the most, frankly, absurd instance of whataboutism. It makes just listening to you say it refutes itself.
I'm not talking about hypotheticals. I'm talking about what has actually happened, and I don't want to see that repeat.
You're talking about something that is not in this bill, and you're equating soybean farmers with a consulting firm that is advising the Chinese military. It's absolutely absurd.
I'm equating national
security. And here
security.
you are opposing, in the name of, you represented taxpayers, you are here testifying in favor, apparently, of allowing a company to take tax money. This is tax money. This is $1 billion in taxpayer money McKinsey is raking in, while also going to our chief adversary, selling our secrets essentially, and making money from them. What could be worse for the American taxpayer? I can't think of anything, which is why this bill passed overwhelmingly in this committee. And I thank you all for your testimony today. Thank you, Senator Peters, again for your hard work on this and support. I appreciate it, and thanks for holding this hearing.
Well, I appreciate your leadership on the issue as well, Senator. Senator Hassan, you're recognized for your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank you and Ranking Member Paul for holding this hearing. I want to thank the witnesses for providing your testimony and expertise on this topic. Dr. Doshi, I understand you are here stepping away from parental leave, that you have a brand new baby, so we are appreciative of you taking the time, and congratulations on your expanding family. That's wonderful. I'm going to ask questions, some of which have been touched on earlier, but I just wanted to kind of get into a dialogue with all of you on some of these issues. And I'm going to start with you, Dean Tillipman. Following up on a line of questions that I understand Senator Peters asked you about. McKinsey & Company, a well-known consulting firm, advised Purdue Pharma on how to influence the Food and Drug Administration's process for evaluating drug safety, while at the same time advising the Food and Drug Administration on how to evaluate the safety of the powerful opioids produced by Purdue Pharma. In 2022, the President signed into law the Bipartisan Preventing Organizational Conflicts of Interest in Federal Acquisitions Act, which Senator Peters and Grassley, Ernst, and I introduced to strengthen federal protection against conflicts of interest in response to McKinsey's really egregious behavior. We are pushing the federal entity responsible for implementing this bill to take swift action to fully implement it as soon as possible. Once it is fully implemented, how will this law help prevent private companies from exploiting their relationships with federal agencies to benefit their other clients, as we saw McKinsey do with the Food and Drug Administration and Purdue Pharma?
Thank you, Senator. At a baseline, it's going to help inform them that this is, in fact, a conflict of interest. I think prior to this hearing, there was confusion even among the procurement community that a commercial conflict could create the type of organizational conflict of interest that we're concerned about. So the hearing alone brought attention to the fact that the law is broad but needs to be broader, and there needs to be additional guidance and directives for the contracting community to make these determinations. But more importantly, it needs to put contractors on notice that these types of conflicts are not acceptable. They need to put compliance programs in place to better disclose these types of conflicts of interest so that procurement officials can make educated, informed business decisions about this and how best to either mitigate the risk or, frankly, avoid contracting with those entities in the first place.
Look, I mean, from my perspective, as somebody whose state has been extraordinarily hard hit early on by the opioid epidemic, the notion that any entity would serve both the FDA and Purdue Pharma on this issue just is extraordinary. And I expect when somebody contracts with the federal government that they will put the people of the United States' interests first. And that's very hard to do when you are also talking to the very manufacturer who, through lies and greed and malevolence, have harmed so many people. So I thank you for the feedback, and we'll continue to work on it. Dr. Doshi, following up on this same question, because of congressional oversight that we did, the Food and Drug Administration no longer contracts with McKinsey because of McKinsey's work for Purdue Pharma. However, several other federal agencies continue to work with McKinsey in other capacities. For example, the Department of Defense recently awarded 2 exclusive contracts to McKinsey, including to evaluate the Army's ammunition supply chain and provide advice to the Space Force. We also know that McKinsey contracts with the Chinese government, again, following up on Senator Hawley's line here, and advise the Chinese on how to develop an intimidating military presence in the South China Sea. Does it concern you that the U.S. continues to work with McKinsey despite this track record? Do you think it is in the best national security interest of the United States to continue contracting with McKinsey?
Well, thank you, Senator. I think that it's important for this legislation to be widened to address exactly the question that you've raised. One is that it's not just a question of whether they contract with the Department of Defense. It's a number of federal agencies that are going to contract with these consulting firms. All of that should be, considered. The second thing that I'm worried about is not just our consulting firms that are doing contracting with the federal government and the Chinese government. It's our technology service providers, because the U.S. government relies on these technology service providers for critical services. The Department of Defense, our defense industrial base, our water sector, our power sector, transportation, telecommunications. So if we have a conflict of interest where those companies go to China, share their source code, or enter into a joint venture which can compromise that service, it affects all of us. So I do have a concern, Senator, to address your question directly with that ongoing work, and I think that concern could apply to other companies as well.
Thank you. Another question for you, Dr. Doshi. As part of last year's National Defense Authorization Act, some Department of Defense contractors will now be required to certify that they do not have similar contracts with China or other foreign entities. Once the Department of Defense fully implements this law, it will provide additional safeguards against conflicts of interest that compromise our national security. How could Congress expand this requirement to agencies other than the Department of Defense? Are you concerned about workarounds or waivers that could undermine the intent of this law?
Well, thank you, Senator. I am concerned about the possibility that if the legislation were written in such a way, or if contracting guidelines were scoped in such a way that companies could find loopholes, then that would be disastrous for us. Again, when it comes to technology service providers, the stakes are so high that we want these companies to think from a risk perspective that the risk of partnering with the PRC or working with the PRC or giving in to their demands is not going to be worth it given the significant revenue hit that they'll take from being cut off, not just from the Department of Defense, but a number of U.S. government agencies. So I want that balance to be in a more conservative direction.
Thank you for that. Last question, and it's to Dean Tillipman. Earlier this year, in violation of U.S. law, consulting companies McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, M. Klein & Company, and Teneo, all of whom are based in the United States, initially refused to comply with subpoenas issued by the Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations. Those subpoenas sought information on the relationship between these companies and the Saudi Arabian government's attempts to influence U.S. policy. While refusing to comply with our subpoenas, these companies chose to follow a ruling from a Saudi court rather than follow U.S. law. It is outrageous that these companies, and let's be clear, they're American companies. They benefit from being able to be based in the United States with all the privileges and opportunities that that brings to citizens and to businesses. It is outrageous that they are profiting off of their deals with the Saudis over protecting the national security interests of the United States. Simply put, if you want to contract with the U.S. government, the world's largest buyer of goods and services, then at a bare minimum, you need to comply with U.S. law, which includes complying with subpoenas from Congress. How can Congress or the Federal Acquisition Regulation Council make clear that U.S. law supersedes the law of a foreign country in the event of a conflict between U.S. and the law of the foreign country, especially in cases involving federal contractors that work with our adversaries?
I think you've put your finger, Senator, on the complexities of multinational companies and doing business with many countries at the same time. I do not have a significant amount of faith that the FAR Council, who is involved with very talented people, could come to an exact solution for that precise problem. But I think you've put your finger also on the fact that this is what occurs when you have contractors encountering these competing interests. You have to basically, I mean, there's a reason that you've named the bill Time to Choose, right? And so I think this is one of the inherent problems with empowering this type of activity. And I think it's why, as the FAR Council continues to hopefully and more speedily consider these issues, it will come down with some more guidance about what a contracting official should be considering. But B, I'm not sure I would empower a contracting official to speak directly to the issue that you raise. But I do agree with you that if companies want to benefit from doing business with the United States or benefit from doing business at all in the United States, that this needs to become a priority.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate all of you, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Hassan. Dr. Doshi, in your testimony, you specified concerns with a U.S. federal contractor providing similar services to an entity with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. My question for you is, do these concerns also apply where a U.S. federal contractor provides services to another foreign government entity besides China?
Thank you, Senator. I think they could apply to foreign governments that have an adversarial relationship with the United States. What differentiates China from, let me take a step back, Senator. A lot of companies are going to be involved in conflicts of interest by the fact that they are involved in multiple jurisdictions. What makes China different from other countries is that this is a country that is planning for conflict with the United States, that is taking American intellectual property, that is working to compromise our critical infrastructure. So here the stakes of those conflicts are so much higher than they are in other cases, including Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. This is a fundamentally different magnitude of harm. So, Senator, I agree that this could apply to other governments. It's just that the Chinese government is the one that I'm most concerned about.
Well, so I want to kind of build on that. You wrote in your testimony about what you call the China cycle, where the Chinese government tilts the playing field in their favor when contracting with companies that are based here in the United States. They're also tilting the playing field in their favor in the electric and autonomous vehicle market by heavily subsidizing their electric vehicles in that industry and flooding foreign markets with these highly subsidized vehicles. Earlier this month, I sent a letter along with my Republican colleague, Senator Blackburn, to several Chinese automakers pressing for more transparency into their ties with the Chinese government and highlighting the significant national security concerns associated with importing vehicles made by companies with ties to the Chinese Communist Party. So my question for you, Dr. Doshi, is besides imposing tariffs or similar measures like that, what else can we do to level the playing field or tilt the field back?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. And maybe I'll spend a moment briefly on the China cycle. The idea here is that multinational companies or U.S. companies are attracted by the lure of China's market. It makes sense. They try to do well in China. Maybe they do well for a period of time. But China has a goal, an industrial policy goal, to indigenize those companies and push them out of China after a period of time. And even our best companies in China have met this fate. Take Apple. They spent decades building China's smartphone industry. They spent billions on building China's machine tools industry. And now its various suppliers have essentially risen in the supply chain to become producers of smartphones. They've pushed Apple essentially to below top 5 in market share in China. Take Tesla as well. It's a similar story. Tesla did very well in China, had a good arrangement with the Shanghai government, but its supply chain in China that it built helped catalyze some of the innovation that helped China's electric vehicle manufacturers outcompete Tesla in Europe and the United States, and potentially down the road in the United States. To answer your specific question, Senator, about what we can do to tilt the playing field on EVs, I mentioned just a few points. First, I would note that a lot of companies in China, 90% of the top 500 enterprises, have Chinese Communist Party cells within them that are involved in the governance of those companies. So strict independence between those companies and the Chinese government is very difficult to imagine. We can't mirror image. It's a different system than ours. The second point, Senator, that I would make is that tariffs really aren't going to get the job done. They're important. They're an important step. But the problem that we face is rules of origin. These countries, China can partner with other countries to make these same EVs in Mexico or Indonesia or elsewhere. So what we really need are regulatory solutions. And what the Biden administration has recently done, as of yesterday, is move forward with an approach that would say, for software or hardware that goes into these internet-connected vehicles, if that's from China, then it can't be sold in the United States. And it's for a very simple reason, Senator. Automotive, internet-connected vehicles are a form of critical infrastructure, and we know that the Chinese are trying to compromise U.S. critical infrastructure in power, in water, in telecommunications, and in transportation. And it stands to reason we should worry about that possibility in EVs as well. So this regulatory approach is easier to coordinate with allies and partners. It's actually something the executive can do pretty quickly, and I think it's actually more effective than tariffs alone.
Another question for you, Dr. Doshi, is another important factor we must consider when we aggressively combat the China cycle, as you call it, are what the potential impacts on the American scientific and technological competitiveness would be if we overly restrict U.S. collaborations with foreign entities on basic research, for example. Question for you is, what are the consequences of overreach there, and how can we prevent overreach?
Well, thank you for that question, Senator. And I think nothing that I've advocated today would dramatically tamp down on trade with China, nor would it necessarily compromise our ability to work with China in science and technology. Those are both important. We are just trying to put guardrails in place so that they can be done more safely and effectively. That said, the United States currently has a science and technology agreement with China that's been in place since normalization. It's lapsed at times and been renewed. One of the biggest challenges we face, Senator, is that the ecosystem in the United States is very open. Anybody can access it. But the ecosystem in China is very closed. So we don't have symmetry. We have an asymmetry here. And what that means in practical terms is that China can benefit more from our ecosystem than we can from theirs. Right now, the legislation in China on national security that I outlined in my testimony makes it very difficult for us to continue with scientific research because we can't get our data out. One of the biggest sticking points to renewing the science and technology agreement has been the question of whether we can come to some kind of agreement with China on questions related to data. So what I would say, Senator, is that what we're talking about here in Time to Choose won't affect science and technology cooperation. If anything, it might give us another piece of leverage, another angle, which we can use to pry open China's approach on national security to make it a bit more symmetrical with our own. And I think that's where we want to end up because China is an innovative country. It's not just stealing American technology. Its science and technology ecosystem is quite advanced. We need to have some exchange with it, but we have to make sure it's done in a way that's fair.
Right. So final question, I'm going to ask Dean Tillipman and Dr. Doshi, we'll start with you, Dean. Should the federal contracts that we have include specific restrictions and penalties around sharing information and data with non-U.S. government clients related to work that's being done for the United States government? Dean Tillipman first, and then Dr. Doshi, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yes. Resoundingly, yes, absolutely. It's one thing for a contracting officer to learn about a potential conflict of interest and to consider whether it needs to, mitigate, avoid, neutralize that particular conflict of interest. It's another thing for a contractor to share the information that they've obtained during the performance of a contractor, particularly with an adversarial government. But even just sharing the basic information is problematic. So yes, there should be extreme penalties for something like that. And frankly, we already have some systems for the disclosure of this type of information in existence. But what you're describing absolutely should be banned.
Thank you. Dr. Doshi.
Senator, I couldn't agree more that this is a critically important element of any kind of protection we want to implement here. Right now, we know that there's 3 ways in which China can compromise any data that might be within China. First, there's institutions it's putting in companies. These include Chinese Communist Party cells. Second, there's the requirement that any employee of a U.S. subsidiary that's from China, or quite frankly, any Chinese partner of that subsidiary, has to comply with PRC intelligence and has to make sure that that compliance is never reported. That is an actual legal requirement of the counter-espionage law from 2017, from the National Security Law of 2017. And third, of course, as I mentioned, access to networks, data, encryption, it's all transparent now under the existing regulatory regime in China. You've got to turn over your encryption keys to the Chinese government. What that means in practice, Senator, is that even a company that has the best data protections, that's extremely careful, that might put its data on the Microsoft cloud in China, cannot be assured that that data does not end up in the hands of the Chinese government, which means that the question of whether or not this kind of sensitive information gained from working with the U.S. government or with U.S. companies, that must be protected. And it can't be used in fulfillment of contracts with the Chinese government. It probably shouldn't be migrated to China, because once it is, it's theirs.
Great. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank our witnesses for joining us here today to share their testimony and their expertise with the committee. Congress and the entire federal government must work together to ensure government contracts are awarded in the best interest of the American people by removing conflicts of interest from contractors' work. Americans certainly deserve full assurance that when their tax dollars are spent on federal contracts, they get the result that benefits them, and not have those funds go to contractors who are working on both sides of the issue in a way that undermines our national security interest. And I look forward to our continued work together on this issue. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on Wednesday, October 9th of 2024. For the submission of statements and questions for the record, this hearing is now adjourned.